It's been a long time coming. I've been playing hundreds, if not thousands, of games over the years. I have perhaps some of the most experience with the best games ever, right? Out of anybody on YouTube, anyone in the sphere, anyone out there. So this is, in a way, kind of a list, a very well created list of the best games I've ever played. My personal favorites. And I suppose I was kind of surprised when I looked at this list, when I kind of finalized it, kind of realized just how much variety there is here, how much like from different consoles, from different developers. Like I play a lot of stuff, and I was kind of shocked at like the titles that didn't make the cut. I was sure Metal Gear Solid 3 would be on there. It wasn't. I thought that like Bad Kaido's Origins would be on there. I've considered those games like to be my favorite in their respective genres for a long time, but in a lot of ways, I suppose my top 10 favorites have been established for a long time now, right? Like, there may be better games out there. There may be better games that, like, are longer, have more things to do, are, like, objectively better. But in a lot of ways, I think these top 10 are never really going to be topped for me personally. And maybe I'll be wrong on that. Maybe I'll make an updated list eventually when I like revisit some older game that I kind of forgot about how good it actually was. I certainly can vouch for the fact that a lot of the stuff on this list is stuff that like I wasn't sure I would put on a top 10 list, honestly. Like there are so many great games out there that obviously you can't fit them all on. And it's kind of disappointing, but it's kind of invigorating too. It's really good to give credit to where credit is due to like legitimately well-made, interesting, great video games. And today we are going to be talking about my top 10 favorite video games ever. I hope you enjoy it.
In my opinion, Ace Attorney Trials and Tribulations is the peak of visual novels in video games. I can't think of any game that has managed to create such memorable characters, such engaging mechanics, and such a unique, interesting concept. More than its contemporaries, I think Ace Attorney has kind of established itself as a really great fringe franchise. Like instead of hunting down enemies or going on like a quest for vengeance, you're playing a lawyer involved in these criminal cases. And it never fails to innovate, do something new, and feel fresh and original. But Trials and Tribulations, more than any other game in the franchise, really pushes the concept to the limit, right? The entire game feels like one overarching fantastic saga that builds up to an amazing conclusion that honestly was built up really well over a series of 3 games, right? It is an experience. And I do think it's the kind of game that can appeal to people of all ages. I played this when I was fairly young. I think most fans were in their 20s when it first came out. And even today, I still see people look back on this title fondly as one of the best games on the DS. And for me personally, I can't think of any other DS game that I played when it was new that blew me away like this one. This was the one that really made me feel as if video games were truly a great method for storytelling. This is the series that really taught me how important it is to have engaging original characters. This is the game that really made me realize that you can do quite a lot with quite a low budget. These games are very, very inexpensive to make. When you compare this to something like LA Noire, right, a game that was significantly more popular, that was significantly higher budget, like you can see the difference in quality, right? Ace Attorney manages to be way more memorable, way more engaging, have way better mysteries, have way more personality, and on a significantly lower budget. Ace Attorney, more than I think any other game I've ever played, has made me really, really invested in the characters, in the world, in the setting. Like, you really end up thinking a lot about these people after you finish the game, to the point where, in a lot of ways, the sequels could never really live up to it. In a lot of ways, I kind of wish the trilogy had ended here, like it was originally planned. Like, in a lot of ways, the sequels suffer because this game is so good. And to this day, I've never really felt as if any visual novel or any other Ace Attorney game or any other game inspired by this, namely Danganronpa, has ever even really come close to what this game has accomplished. It has a surprisingly mature story. It has incredible characters, unforgettable moments, like the best cases in the franchise. There are no bad cases in Trials and Tribulations. And above all, they all tie together really, really well and create something that kind of surpasses itself. I was surprised when I went back through all of the games I've played over the years and realized just how much this game meant to me and how it cracked the top 10. I've always considered it one of my favorite games ever, but looking back on it, like, this game means more to me than I think I've ever really given it credit for. I was shocked when I went through my list and realized what I wanted to put on the number 9 position. The game that over the past several years I've been comparing every other JRPG to, Dragon Quest VII: Fragments of the Forgotten Past. Now, this feels like a game I've played relatively recently, but I played the 3DS version when it came out in 2017, so I suppose it's been a long time. I've been thinking about going back to the game. I looked into getting another version of it. I would buy it again if it came to Switch in a heartbeat. I was thinking about taking it off the shelf and playing it again, but I have so many other Dragon Quest games I want to get through first, right? When I come back to this game, and when I first finished it, I honestly didn't think I would. I I wanted it to be after I played every other Dragon Quest game. This is the first Dragon Quest game I ever played, and in a lot of ways, I had a very rough experience with it. This is, of course, a notoriously long, grindy JRPG. I've heard it said that this is the longest JRPG ever if you intend to do everything. And it was an exhausting experience playing through this over a period of months in 2017. I really considered giving up around the 15-hour mark, and by the end, I felt kind of burned out on it. But like, when all is said and done, like, when I think back to what playing this game was actually like, I had the best time I've ever had with a JRPG. When I look back and think of like all the incredible characters, all of the creative scenarios, the simplistic combat system, like, the memorable moments, like, when I think back on all of that, the unique concept, right? When I think back on all of that, I think to myself that, like, this is the most fun I've ever had with a JRPG. The only one that ever came close was, another title I considered for this list, Baten Kaitos Origins. But like, I think in a lot of ways, Dragon Quest VII is better than that game. Maybe it's because like a recency bias, right? I've uh I've been playing Baten Kaitos Origins casually over the past couple of years. I've been playing through it again, and I still love the game, but I'm not sure I would put it in my top 10. But like, when I think back to the experience of playing Dragon Quest VII, like, I don't remember like having those tedious moments in Baten Kaitos Origins where like you're struggling with the holo bird, or like you have to go back through an old area. Like with Dragon Quest VII, it's like fresh, unique experiences throughout the entire thing. You're always meeting crazy new characters. You're always getting into these crazy situations, and like you get into these amazing adventures throughout the entire thing. And yeah, sure, it drags. Sure, you feel like the game should end, like, like fair, like way sooner than it does. But like, when you look back on your experience, you feel like you had a true epic adventure. And that, to me, means a lot, right? Like Dragon Quest VII is the reason I've fallen in love with Dragon Quest. It's weird to think about, but I've come to realize over the past several years that I think I like Dragon Quest more now than I ever did Final Fantasy, which is what I grew up with. That I like it more than any other JRPG franchise I've ever played, and it all began with seven. Like I've liked four. I'm liking what I've played of five. I liked eight. I liked 11. 11. I was shocked when I realized it's actually one of my most played games on Nintendo Switch. I liked all those games, but when all is said and done, Dragon Quest VII is absolutely my favorite out of all of them. And I think as a whole, it is the JRPG that I compare every other JRPG to. This is what I'm looking for in a game like this. I really struggled coming to terms with what Pokemon game I wanted to put on the list. Do I want to put Black on there? Do I want to put Silver? Do I want to put like something like Stadium? But I really do think there's no denying that my personal favorite, even if it's not the best, is the Gen 1 games. Red, Blue, and Yellow. Particularly Yellow. I got footage of Yellow for this, but when I look back on like why I really, really love the franchise, when I think of like the low fantasy setting, when I think about like the game that introduced me to the concept, when I think about like the 90s sprite work, when I think about like the original aesthetic, like learning to play the game for the first time, learning how to catch Pokemon and learning how to team build and like how type advantages work. When I think back to all of that, like, yeah, Yellow is the one that introduced me to all of that. And every single other Pokemon game, even all time classics like Silver and Gold, right? They were very much influenced by this. And in a lot of ways, like Silver is does have a lot of its own problems, right? Like Gen 3 has its problems, Gen 4 has its problems, but like this was the first, right? This is the one that really established what makes the formula work. And when I think back on it, like for that reason alone, I think of this as my favorite. I I think back to like how attached I was to every single of the 151 Pokemon. I think back to how like attached, how much I liked gym leaders, how much I liked the anime. That was based on this game. I look back on all of that. I look back on like countless hours like playing through this game, finding all the secrets, exploring the world, like discovering like where Pokemon were hiding, like trading and battling, right? Like this was the reason to own a link cable back in the day. When I think back on it, like there was a time where the only reason I even owned a Game Boy was because of Pokemon. There were a lot of games on the console, right? But like I wasn't really interested in a lot of Game Boy or Game Boy Advance games at the time. The most popular Nintendo console of all time at the time, and I was mostly interested in it for one video game franchise, one franchise that just blew me away with its creativity, with its world building, with its design, with its characters, with its aesthetic, with its personality, right? Like it's so weird, like thinking how much you remember iconic moments from this game. The Team Rocket bridge. Those guys that break into the house. The casino, right? Going through Mount Moon for the first time. Learning surf, like going through, like learning and seeing just how much there is to see in this game. Like uncovering everything the game has to offer. It just goes on and on and on and on. And catching all 150 Pokemon is a real achievement, a real accomplishment that I've never actually managed because I've never been able to get my hands on two copies of the game and was able to trade them all. And of course, like you have like the Mew thing, 151, which isn't even obtainable through normal means, right? Like this game kickstarted the biggest media franchise in the world, right? Even today, I get excited like thinking about the future of Pokemon and the future of Pokemon products. When I think back to like a lot of other things I liked as a kid, it's weird to see just how like Pokemon of all things is the thing that's very very relevant in my life, right? The thing that I really would like to take the time to get back into to really really like get more competitively involved, like actually it's an amazing experience, right? Like growing up with Pokemon, it's kind of a cultural thing for millennials, like people in my age group, like just how significant this game was for Game Boy owners and Nintendo fans. It's probably a big reason why Nintendo thrived so much in the 90s, thrived so much with the Game Boy. And I've seen so many people like speak ill of this game over the years, and it really is something that I straight up laugh at because the game is just phenomenal, right? Like this is an endlessly replayable RPG where you can experiment with your team building, with your with the route you take, with the moves you learn. Like there's so much you can do to excel at this game. There's so much technical depth here, despite like being so simplistic on the surface. Like it is crazy to think about, but the game has held up. Every time I play it, even now, I'm anxiously re-releasing awaiting a release on Nintendo Switch Online. Every time I play this game, I just find myself like completely taken aback by how good it actually is. And unfortunately, it's one of those games that like I've kind of played to death over the years. Lately, I've been thinking that like maybe I should give Soul Silver, so like Gen 2 or Gen 5 another go, right? But like there's a very good reason why this specifically is the game I always come back to whenever I want to play classic Pokemon because it really, really is something special. Oh yeah. Every time you saw that title screen, you knew you were about to see the greatest game ever made. It's weird to think, but this is probably one of the very first Nintendo games I ever played, right? Like, and it only made number 7 on my list. That is crazy to think about, but there is no denying that DK's Donkey Kong Country and its sequel, Donkey Kong Country 2, have been two of my favorite Super Nintendo games in recent years. And in a lot of ways, I think Donkey Kong Country 2 is a lot better than this. I think the level design is tighter. I think like the characters are better balanced. I think there's like more content. But like at the end of the day, growing up with like DKC 1 specifically, and considering how difficult DKC 2 is to get into for someone who isn't a hardcore fan, even today, I find myself surprised how enjoyable this game is. This is one of those games that I think a lot of people even today play as their first ever Nintendo game. One of their first platformers ever. It's kind of shocking to think about this, but like the visual style and the artistry still resonates with people today, right? This is classic Super Nintendo, just visual design. It's crazy comparing this to other Nintendo games like Super Mario World and just seeing just those 3D models in motion, seeing like the creative background, seeing like the environments, seeing like just the locales and just like it looks like a playable cartoon in a lot of ways. And I feel the same way about Donkey Kong 64, where it feels like Rareware really understood how to make an art style that would stand the test of time. Because the main reason this was so big back in the day was because of how technically demanding it all was. But if you realize this today, if you look at like games being made today, you'll see just how quickly that like games that are like designed to be stylistic or especially beautiful, stuff like BioShock Infinite, for example, how quickly those games feel dated. But when you look at this, when you see like how this looks, like when you play it like even today, like you're taken in by like the genuine passion and creativity and just like aesthetic appeal of the characters, right? You don't care that this game came out in 94. You don't care that it's technically outdated because the game looks and plays so well, and it's so straightforward, right? It's so easy to understand and to get into and to finish. And as you play through the game, it's not very long. As you play through the game, you really appreciate the artistry and just the general design. How you're always doing something different. How each stage has a completely unique, fresh gimmick. How like both characters feel completely different from one another. Like you appreciate everything the game does. It just builds up to just this phenomenal finale that even today is shockingly difficult for even experienced players. I know people who have played this game after, 10, 20 years of not really touching it and being surprised at how challenging the final boss is, right? Like the game is definitely a lot easier than DKC 2 or 3, and a lot of people use that as a knock, but I personally think it's a big part of its appeal. Like the reason why it's still played to this day is that like it is easy to get into, right? It is easy to understand. It is easy to play. It's very very easy to understand why this game is fun. And I think in a lot of ways this is a game that has that over its contemporaries. Yoshi's Island is kind of hard to understand in comparison. Super Mario World is kind of hard to understand in comparison. The new Super Mario Bros. Games, even like the new Donkey Kong Country games, I think they don't have quite the same vibe. And although I think those games are better in a lot of respects, with way more demanding stage design, way more content, like way more things to do in general, like there's no denying that there's something like really special about this game that just appeals to me even now. And in recent years, I've kind of played this game to death. I'm kind of taking a break from it at the moment, but even now, recording this footage, I just get excited seeing seeing these stages again. Seeing like how much this game just manages to deliver with like such limited technology back in the 90s. Like comparing this to other games that came out around the same time period is just mind-boggling. It's in a lot of ways I hope this game kind of eventually has a resurgence of popularity because it feels like in recent years people aren't talking about this as much. I've seen people call this like an overrated game on the Super Nintendo, but it really is one of the console's best. And I still think of it as one of my favorite games of all time. I had to fight to prevent myself from putting multiple Zelda games on this list. There are so many great ones that I probably could have just made a top 10 games ever list and just had every single entry be a Zelda game. Ocarina of Time could have been on here, Link's Awakening could have been on here, the original Zelda could have been on here, Majora's Mask, Breath of the Wild, A Link Between Worlds, the sequel to this. All right, they're all great games, but like I don't think there's any denying that the one I've played the most over the years is A Link to the Past. And I suppose for that reason alone, it is my favorite. It's weird to think about because I think growing up I had much more of a fondness for Ocarina of Time, but I grew up in the era where that game was really, really, really cutting edge. And A Link to the Past was kind of outdated when I first played it. But like I think as I've gotten older, I've really started leaning more towards A Link to the Past. Not necessarily because I think it's a better game because both are great, but like there's something about these old Super Nintendo games that's just way more replayable. Right? They don't have a lot of drawn out story sequences. They don't have a lot of padding. They don't have like a lot of backtracking. Like they're very, very straightforward. And I really appreciate that about them. And A Link to the Past, I think, strikes a really good balance between the classic OG Zelda of like having that Western inspired fantasy feel while being very similar in style and gameplay to the later games, right? This is kind of the missing link between the two styles of gameplay, and in a lot of ways, it's the best of both worlds, right? I know plenty of people who prefer the NES games. I know people who prefer like the Ocarina style. I know people who prefer the open world style of Breath of the Wild on world, right? Like everybody has their preferences, but I think A Link to the Past is the one that kind of ties all of that together. It's the title that I see most people playing and talking about. It's the most well-known retro title. Like there's definitely an audience for stuff in other points of the franchise. Of course, like Link's Awakening is popular among core fans. Majora's Mask is popular among YouTubers. Twilight Princess was popular among normies. Breath of the Wild is popular with everyone, right? Like, but it feels more and more as if a lot of like people's favorite Zelda games are the ones that they grew up with, right? And a lot of times they don't necessarily play every Zelda game that exists, right? So they don't have the full context as to like what else is out there, right? I know a lot of people who like Link's Awakening who don't really talk about like the Oracle games, for example, because like there was a whole decade between the release of those titles, right? I know people who don't care for Skyward Sword, right? Like I know people who've never played A Link to the Past, A Link Between Worlds, despite loving A Link to the Past. Like, there's a very notable generation gap when it comes to a lot of this stuff, where like it feels like this series has gone on so long and has so many like genre-defining titles that a lot of people, a lot of fans have completely different ideas as to like what constitutes a great Zelda game. But the one that I think everyone comes back to, the game that I think people first play when they try getting into the wider world of Zelda, when they try experimenting with titles like outside of their wheelhouse, when they try like playing a retro game, when they try playing the one that's considered the best, I feel that like everyone goes for A Link to the Past. And I really don't see myself as being any different. Like I've played this game several times over the past couple of years. I played Ocarina a couple of times. I played Majora's Mask. I've played like Wind Waker. I started a Twilight Princess playthrough. Like I play a lot of Zelda, right? But I played this one the most, right? It is the most fun to actually play. It does have an incredible variety of dungeons. It has an insane weapon lineup. It has like this really cool sense of progression. It has the really unique light and dark world feature. It has like iconic moments. It has it all, really. And the game does feel dated in a lot of ways, but like even now, like I think the game really, really holds up. I think it's really easy to get into. It is one of those Super Nintendo games that I think even today that a lot of younger players can get into and appreciate. And I think that's a big part of what makes this game so special. Like I expect that this is going to be the Zelda game I show my kids one day. And that is a really interesting thing to think about. It's shocking to me that Super Metroid did only crack the top five. Like it's so weird to think about because I knew it wasn't going to be number one or two, but like it's such an iconic game. It's such like a monumental achievement when it comes to video game storytelling, when it comes to the Metroid-like design, when it comes to like the mechanics, like the general structure, the dark tone, the gorgeous sprite work, right? Like when you think back on this game, it's considered the best ever made. And I suppose this is a list made of like iconic great titles. But like to see this game like make in a top 10 list and not be number one is just weird to me. Even though this is my list and like I definitely have thought a lot about how I'm going to rank these games and how I consider them and just how much I value them and stuff like that. And I think back to how much this game means to me and how much time I put into it and how much like I love everything about it. When I think about all of that, like the game is still number five, right? Like it's so weird to think about to see it only at number five. But I suppose that just goes to show you just how much value I get out of the games higher than this because I think this is the game that a lot of people consider to be the pinnacle of Nintendo game design, right? I've seen so many people classify this as the best game ever made and the best game on Super Nintendo, which I actually do agree with in a lot of ways. Uh, it's there's no denying the game is a masterpiece, and for me, it's a game that comes with a lot of memories. This is a game that I could not beat as a kid, that I really struggled with, that I really had to spend a lot of time with. I think more than any other Super Nintendo game I owned, I was kind of scared of this game, honestly. Every time I would pop it in, I couldn't get very far in it, and I would struggle with it and like slowly make my way through it. And eventually I managed to discover Kraid, and I managed to move on from there. Like by the time I got to Fantoon, I think I was at the point where I could get through the entire thing. But that took a lot of time. It took a lot of effort. And the more I think about it, the more I like really value that experience. It's really unlike any other game experience I personally have ever had. And I understand that it's kind of a personal thing. Most people, I think, look back on this game mostly because of its stellar gameplay, but like I look back on this game and think about like how rough it was for me playing through it for the first time. Like the time I got stuck in that cavern in Prince-Star that you have to wall jump out of. Like when I think back to like the time I got stuck in this room full of side hoppers. Actually, that's happened a couple of times because I couldn't figure out how to get them off me, right? When I think back to fighting Kraid for the first time, or like finally beating Mother Brain and escaping the planet. Like it was just a monumental achievement. It's like one of those things that just means more to me than anything. And I think a big part of it is because I was so young, but there's no denying that the reason the game had such an impact on me was its overall quality, right? This game is stunning. It's hard to believe this ran on a Super Nintendo, right? Like for a long time, I saw this as like the pinnacle of 2D sprite work, and in a lot of ways, I still kind of think that. I'm sure there's like some modern game that kind of surpasses it, but when it comes to like the atmosphere, when it comes to the mood, when it comes to the general structure, the game is relatively unmatched. I compare this game to other more modern Metroid likes. When I compare it to like Hollow Knight, when I compare it to like the Castlevania games, even when I compare it to Dread, like the game just hits notes that no other game even comes close to matching. It's kind of embarrassing in this way that the genre was so defined by this one title. And the game is so ubiquitous that it's one of those sacred cow things that I don't think anybody who wants to be taken seriously in this community would ever try trash talking it. I've never seen anyone try like talking badly about this game other than like Sean Malmstrom. But like um when I see this game in action, when I see other people play it, when I see other people talk about it, like it's one of the only games on this list that has like a universally positive reception. And to me, I think that's really special. This channel has really been defined a lot by people just crying a lot about like Nintendo games and their products and their hardware or whatever. It's such a different experience to talk about a game that everybody universally loves. Having recently had the honor of playing through Star Fox 64 again on Nintendo Switch Online's online service, I really began to appreciate just what this game means to me and just how good it actually is. Because I've always been very vocal about this series and its reception. I've seen a lot of people over the past year, especially after the release of Star Fox Zero, try and act as if Star Fox is some like stale, outdated property that can't innovate, that can't do anything new, that needs to move past being a simple rail shooter, right? I've seen so many people praise stuff like Assault and kind of downplaying 64 and all of its accomplishments. there's this very strange narrative that these kind of arcade rail shooters would not be able to succeed in today's market. But seeing how much I enjoy playing Star Fox 64, seeing how well this game is remembered, seeing how popular it is today, seeing how I've put more time into it than almost any other N64 game, the only exception being I believe F-Zero X. When I look at this game, when I think back to how I've played through it thousands of times since I was a kid, when I think back to like just how well made it is and just how much room for improvement there is, like it really is a shame that it took so long to get such a high quality sequel in Star Fox Zero because this really is an IP that should have thrived on the GameCube, should have thrived on the Wii, should have thrived on the Wii U. Like, this really should have been a Nintendo mainstay franchise because Star Fox 64 in a lot of ways is better than a lot of major entries in established Nintendo properties. I would say this is better than any Pikmin game. I would say this is better than the vast bulk of Metroid games. I would say it's better than like Mario games or like a lot of titles out there. Like it really is a title that kind of stand on its own as like an all-time classic. And unlike most other Nintendo properties, like it's been stagnant ever since like obtaining that status. Like it's weird to see how beloved Star Fox 64 is, how much like I praise the game, how much I think back fondly on it, how much I still play this game today, how much mileage I've gotten out of this game, how this was an icon of the Nintendo 64, like the reason to own a console, right? Like it's so strange to look back on all of that and kind of realize that like 64 is where it all ended. Adventures was disappointing for a lot of people. Assault was disappointing. Command was disappointing. And like Zero, despite being the best sequel we've ever gotten, was unfortunately pretty heavily downplayed by the community. Even now, I don't think people really appreciate it for being the true evolution of the 64 formula that we've all been waiting for since 97, right? And in a lot of ways, Zero doesn't quite live up to what 64 managed to accomplish with its, unique visual style, with its mission structure. But in other ways, Zero is better than this, with like its mechanics, with its controls, with its boss fights. Like Zero does feel like a true evolution to the formula in a lot of ways, and it's such a shame that it never really got credit for that. But like in a lot of ways, 64 has become such a legendary title that I'm not sure that a sequel could have been possible. When I look at what happened with Metroid, how like they produced such an incredible experience with Metroid Prime and how effectively that was written off, in spite of legit being one of the best games ever made, right? Like when I look back on that, like I think to myself, like, would it have even been possible to follow up on 64? Like in a lot of ways, it feels like anything they would have come up with would have been a disappointment. Like maybe in some way, shape, or form, having this game stand on its own and having like fans like me just endlessly replay it over and over again and like knowing everything about it, every intricacy, every secret, every enemy placement, like on both difficulties, right? Like when you spend so much time with a game because there's no real sequel, you really start to understand its value and just how it's truly a unique product, something that just that nothing can ever really replicate. And in a lot of ways, I think Star Fox 64 is the best on-rail shooter ever made. Like I think back to what everything this game did with its presentation, with its like controls, with like all the things you could do, its unique boss fights, like the multiple endings. Like I think back to all of that and I just think to myself that like, yeah, this is a monumental achievement in video games. This is the defining experience of Nintendo 64. This is one of those games that's like stood the test of time to the point where like it really feels like it hasn't aged all that well, all that badly at all. Right? Like sure you can complain about the sprite work and like, the length of the levels and like the fact that you have to play it in one sitting or whatever, but it's in a lot of ways this game has never really been topped in this genre. Like nothing has even really come close. Nothing's really ever tried, but this was a product of its time. Like this is a kind of game that doesn't really get made anymore. And as a result of it, like the genre kind of peaked here. There's never really been a successful follow-up that really managed to take the ideas established by this game and improve on them. And in some ways that's a shame, but I suppose in others that just is a testament to its overall quality. It really is phenomenal seeing just how well this game has stood the test of time. I don't think any video game on this list has left such an impact on me creatively as the Bayonetta IP did. I think Bayonetta, more than anything, kind of established the direction my books would take. It kind of established my love for this kind of like exaggerated action franchise. It kind of established the things I wanted to make, the kind of characters I wanted to write, the kind of things I wanted to happen in my books. And even today, I can still feel its influence. Every time I play this game, I find myself shocked at how well made it is, how well animated it is, how well directed the cutscenes are, like the personality, like the style. Really, no other action game really comes close to this. This really is on a caliber beyond that of any other game I've ever played. And it really has earned its status as being one of my favorite games ever made. Right? Like the technical depth is incredible, the enemy design is impeccable, like the level design is great, the replayability is amazing, like the medal system, like all the weapons you can use, like it all just blends together to create like this incredible experience that really, really hasn't been matched. Bayonetta 2 was a major disappointment, and 3 was fantastic for what it was, right? Like, I loved 3. I love Lost Demon, but, like, I do think in a lot of ways it's not really going to be possible to top the original because the original really raised the bar for what a video game is capable of when it comes to like action, when it comes to like just combat, when it comes to just the kind of structure, the kind of game Bayonetta is. Like it just excels at what it's trying to do. Coming up with a unique character, with a unique conflict, with like an incredibly creative combat system that's incredibly versatile and just endlessly entertaining. Right? When you look at what this game managed to accomplish, how it managed to grow out of such a mediocre video game franchise like Devil May Cry, when you actually look at what the creators managed to accomplish here, you come away with this feeling that these were at the time the best developers in the industry. These were people who had the talent and the skill to put out games that no other creator would ever dare make. And I think the reality is that Bayonetta has established itself as a really controversial video game IP. Like every time I see the series in the news, there's some controversy. Like, when this game came out, it was like too sexualized. And then when 2 came out, it was like the Nintendo exclusive thing. And then 3 came out, and then you had the backlash towards the ending and the voice actor thing. Like, there's like a bazillion kinds of controversies attached to this IP. It's kind of crazy to think about. And those controversies, unfortunately, have kind of led to this mindset in the community that this series isn't anything special. But in reality, it really is one of my all-time favorites. I love everything about the games. I adore them. I think they're incredibly well-made titles. I think back on them, especially the original, extremely fondly. And they're titles that just really, I think, speak volumes about the superiority of Japanese game development. Because this is a title that never would have came out of the West, right? This is a title that really revels in just being something unique and different and distinct and like really emphasizing on like the fun of the character and the design. And it's just something that would never have been made from any other studio or come from any other country. It's just, it really, this is, I think, like evidence at just far how much further ahead, like a small Japanese studio like Platinum Games is compared to the rest of the industry. This is a studio that used to put out some of the best action games in the world and used to just deliver banger after banger, year after year. Like every time they would make an announcement a decade ago, it was a big, exciting deal. And a big reason for that was Bayonetta. A big reason for that was that they proved themselves so well with this release. And to me, I think that really just demonstrates just how special this game actually is. Like we had a lot of hope for Platinum Games when this game first hit the market, and now seeing what Platinum Games has become, I'm thankful this game exists. I'm thankful the team made it. I'm thankful that like this product was made, right? Like I love this game and I will always recommend it to other people no matter what the future of the Bayonetta IP holds. This game is always going to be the peak of the genre. Now we're getting into the really good stuff. No More Heroes, one of the most innovative, unique, interesting, novel concepts for a video game ever. One of my all-time favorite games being talked about on my top 10 best ever list. Like, for a long time, this was my absolute favorite. And a big reason for that was because I didn't have access to my absolute favorite for a long time. But, like, looking back on the period of my life where I discovered No More Heroes, that was a wild period. That was like crazy. Like it felt like every weekend you would go out to the local game store and just pick out some $15 thing, like looking at like the Wii, all these like used Wii titles. You'd find stuff like Excitebots, Little King's Story, Last Story, Pandora's Tower, Wario Land Shake It, like so many great games. But the one that stuck out the most to me almost immediately when I first saw it was No More Heroes. Something about the design and like just the general just praise it got from players really made me interested in trying this one out. So I bought this on a whim. It was a really wild experience, right? Like I bought this on the same day as I believe Metal Gear Solid 2 and Zack and Wiki Quest for Barbossa's Treasure, both of which are considered classics in their own right. But that entire weekend, I spent the entire thing just playing through No More Heroes, just thrilled at seeing like each new boss, each new stage, each new plot development, each new character introduction. I was just enthralled by it. In a lot of ways, this specifically is the game that really fired me up about becoming a creator myself, because it really made me realize the kind of things I was interested in, the kind of things I wanted to see, the kind of product I wanted to develop. And Even today, like every time I come back to this game, like every couple of years or so, it feels like a crazy experience. And it's such a weird thing too, because it would be really easy to say the game is mid, right? It's like what, like about 10 hours long. There's lots of moments where you're not really doing anything. You have like the mini game sections. Combat's kind of simplistic. The game doesn't look great. It was a budget title even then, but like somehow the game the game just comes together really well and just creates like an absolute masterpiece, something that I never really got tired of. I still see it as my favorite game in the series, even though I like every other No More Heroes game after this. Like this is a really impressive game and one that I wish more people would talk about. Like I wish more people understood just how good this game actually is. And I suppose the fact that this game exists is a really good indication of just how badly things have fallen since then. Video games are not what they once were. Like there was a period in like the mid 2000s where it felt like we were getting all kinds of crazy off the wall like interesting stuff like this. Stuff like Odama, stuff like Pikmin, stuff like Killer 7, which is from the same creator as the Suda 51. Like it felt for a long time that we were getting some really crazy stuff, and lately it feels like it's been stagnant. Like these days, like a game like this wouldn't get made. A big complaint a lot of people had with No More Heroes 3 was that like it did feel a lot more sanitized. It did feel stripped down. It didn't feel the same way as No More Heroes 1 did. And of course, like, a big problem with No More Heroes 2 was that like it did feel like a rehash of the original in a lot of ways. So like in a lot of ways, I suppose like innovative, interesting ideas like this can't be replicated. A part of me really wishes this game never got a sequel because in a lot of ways, the direction they took with No More Heroes 2 and 3 and Traffic Strikes Again, like they kind of took away the mystery and the intrigue of this game and its characters. And it's definitely an interesting topic to discuss, like whether only like how much of the originals, like how much of the sequels have like taken away from the original. Like I personally don't feel as if the original has gotten worse with time. I still really enjoy it, but it's an interesting thing to talk about. It's That's the thing about No More Heroes in general is just like it's so much fun to talk about and describe to people. Like, the general premise of being a guy, saving a girl. Like in every other game, it's just some vague thing of like, oh, you have to help her. But in this one, it's like you're explicitly trying to sleep with her, right? It's such a weird subversion of this like classic concept, taken to its logical conclusion that like it comes off as like a really novel idea. It's like honestly such a unique thing and really makes the game feel like it has this weird kind of edge to it that has never really been replicated by any other game since. There is a lot of things to be said about this game. I want to continue talking about the game in the future. I've talked about it extensively in the past. I would like to make edited videos talking about like every aspect of this game and what makes it work, but let it be known that this is my second favorite video game of all time. And my number one favorite game of all time is Yoshi's Island. It's so weird to think that I grew up with this game, but didn't really get a chance to 100% it until I was much older. Actually, not all that long ago. So in a lot of ways, this was kind of the grand finale of my childhood in video games, right? Because I've always loved this game. I love the artistic direction. I love the design. I love Yoshi. This was the first Mario game I ever owned. I suppose this was my introduction to the character, which I suppose is a really good starting point considering what this game is actually about. I love like the levels and how unique they were, like the enemy designs, the bosses, like it all just culminated in an experience that I consider to be like the peak of all video games because in a lot of ways this is more than a platformer. In a lot of ways it's more than a collectathon. It's more than just an origin story for Mario. It's like legit a really good example of just how much you can get out of a video game, right? Like, this is a game that looks like it could come straight out of a children's playbook, but it's something you can play around with. Like, it's something with a lot of really interesting mechanics, a lot of things you can do. And I think a thing that really sets this game apart from a lot of its competitors is that you don't have to engage with a lot of its mechanics. Like, you don't have to eat enemies if you don't want to. You don't have to throw eggs if you don't want to. You don't have to mess around with superstars if you don't want to. You don't have to explore or collect things if you don't want to. Like, if you're being like a basic player, if you're like a little kid playing this game, like, you're just going to get to the end, have a good time, and get to experience the joy of playing the game, like, all the way to the end, and then maybe years later you'll come back and kind of realize that, like, wow, this game is filled with soul, right? Like, that's the way that 4chan always describes this kind of thing, is that this game is like soulful, right? This game just oozes style and creativity and charm and just has so many things to do that it really is endlessly replayable and just endlessly enjoyable, and just really is, I think, probably the best game that Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka have ever produced together. Right? This is like their masterpiece. And like going forward from this, the big focus became on 3D games and like exploring that new genre. Like, this game really does feel like the end of an era, right? There were 2D Nintendo games that came out after this, stuff like Kirby's Dream Land 3 and, a handful of classic Super Nintendo titles. Donkey Kong Country 3 came out after this. There were a handful of games, Super Mario RPG. There were a handful of games that have gone on to be classics, but in a lot of ways, this is the Super Nintendo's best, right? It's a toss-up between this and Super Metroid for sure, but I do think that Yoshi's Island does kind of surpass it in a lot of ways, simply because of just how novel it is. Even today, even after like years and years of Yoshi games, right? Like, the game really just demonstrates just how creative Nintendo Studios actually are, right? They really came up with this crazy fantasy world for this game that like feels like it's lived in, feels like the characters belong, feels like it's leading up to something bigger with like all of the endless amount of sequels that Mario and friends have been in, from Mario Party to Mario 64 to everything that came after. Like, this game was, I think, a really good indication of where Nintendo was going to go into the future. And in the 2000s, we got lots of crazy games like this. We got innovative titles like Pikmin, like Super Smash Bros. Melee, like Mario Sunshine, like Luigi's Mansion, that really did feel as if they built up off of this in a lot of ways. This game really demonstrated that, like, wow, the Mario universe is so fleshed out now that they can make a game based on one of Mario's side characters, on Yoshi, and make it good. In the NES era, there was like this puzzle game phenomenon where everyone just got like puzzle themed spin-offs, like like Wario's Woods, where you got to play as Toad, and then like Yoshi's Cookie or whatever. Like, those games were fine for what they were, but they weren't like real fleshed out adventures like this one was, right? Like, they weren't massive deals like this one was. And I think this game specifically kind of ushered in this era of just the Mario spin-off game. I think a lot of Luigi's Mansion can be found in this game. I think Princess Peach Showtime will have a lot of influences by this. I think this game is just an incredible experience from start to play. It's definitely a game I would recommend to just about anybody